Life after the divorce was calm and structured, yet it was nothing like the life I had envisioned in my youth. When I was younger, I believed that by the time I turned 40, I would have it all: a stable family, a house, and perhaps even the fulfillment of my dreams. However, reality proved to be entirely different. I faced a divorce. My ex-husband left for his young assistant, and I constantly struggled to maintain a normal life, leaving me with only my son and a small flower shop by the coast. Floristry became my refuge. I could easily spend hours tending to flowers, selecting colors and textures, and crafting the perfect bouquets for weddings and other celebrations. My work provided a distraction from the overwhelming changes in my life. Surrounded by the vibrant hues and gentle fragrances of the flowers, I found comfort. My son, Thomas, was my only close companion. At 23, he was on the brink of independence, navigating his studies and contemplating future plans. I aimed to be a supportive mother, always encouraging him. Still, there were moments when I sensed he no longer needed me, that he was capable of managing things on his own. Occasionally, when Thomas brought friends over, I would retreat to the shop for a while to avoid interrupting their conversations and laughter. I wanted him to experience life fully, without the burden of worrying about me. Among his friends was Zach, a tall, athletic guy who always had a smile on his face. He and Thomas had been friends since childhood. Zach was 2 years older than Thomas and exuded a sense of calm and confidence that I admired. He often dropped by for lunch or just to chat, and I would see him as the same boy who used to play in our garden with Thomas. However, I began to notice changes. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but Zach's glances shifted. They became more attentive and intense. I initially thought it was merely my imagination running wild. Yet, one evening, when Thomas was late returning from school, Zach unexpectedly walked into my shop. We engaged in our usual conversation, but at some point, he grew more serious. As I described a new floral arrangement I was working on for a big wedding, I realized he was listening with unusual focus, as if he were trying to grasp something deeper than my words. "You're amazing," he suddenly interrupted. I paused and met his gaze, trying to comprehend his compliment. "I've always admired your work. You infuse so much soul into it." His words felt genuine, and I was warmed by the praise. We continued chatting, and as is often the case during quiet evenings, the lights outside went out. We were left in a semi-darkness, lit only by the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through the window. I joked about being prepared for anything, even unexpected power outages. But the humor felt forced, as I sensed something more profound in the air. In that stillness, Zach moved closer to me. His eyes glimmered in the dim light, and for a brief moment, I lost myself in his gaze. He leaned in slowly and gently kissed the corner of my lips, softly, hesitantly, as if uncertain about my reaction. I flinched but didn't immediately pull away, frozen in that moment, unsure of how to respond. It was like a sudden spark, quick, unexpected, and almost painful. I stepped back, attempting to regain my composure, but that moment had already left an indelible mark. We stood in silence, both of us uncertain about how to proceed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't know what came over me." He took a step back, and I nodded, struggling to articulate the conflicting emotions swirling within me. When he left, I was alone in the dark shop. Though brief, that moment stirred feelings within me that I had long tried to suppress. Too many years had gone by since I allowed myself to feel this way. I had spent too much time living within rigid boundaries, afraid to venture beyond them. And now, I stood there, engulfed by a strange mix of shame, excitement, and uncertainty, realizing that this evening had fundamentally altered something in my life. In the days following, I attempted to convince myself it had all been a misunderstanding, a foolish accident that would never repeat itself. Yet, Zach's words and that fleeting kiss lingered in my mind. I fell back into my usual routine. Mornings at the shop were followed by lunches with Thomas, who would return home from school or practice. I strove to be a model of resilience and calmness for him, even as a storm of unexpressed emotions swirled inside me. Despite my efforts to regain normalcy, I found myself glancing at my phone with anticipation, waiting for messages or calls from Zach. But he didn't reach out. Days passed, and it felt as if he was deliberately avoiding me, that I no longer mattered to him. I told myself this was how it should be, that it was for the best. He was my son's friend, and I couldn't allow myself to blur that line for even a moment. One evening, when Thomas headed to a nearby city for a sports competition, I decided to stay late at the shop to work on new orders. As I crafted bouquets in the enveloping silence, it helped me forget my worries. Suddenly, I heard a knock at the shop door. I hadn't been expecting anyone, especially at that hour. There stood Zach, looking a bit lost, as though he weren't sure why he had come. In his hands were a pack of coffee and croissants, clearly picked up along the way. "I thought you might be here alone," he said with a smile that concealed his inner tension. "I figured I could keep you company." I welcomed him inside, doing my best to mask my surprise and slight nervousness. We settled at a small table, and he began to share his plans, how challenging it was to juggle work and studies. As I listened, I suddenly realized that beneath his confident demeanor and smiles lay a person also searching for answers to his own questions. I began to notice how his gaze lingered on me, as if he were waiting for something but didn't dare to express his thoughts. We chatted, laughed, and reminisced about the past, trying to make up for lost time. It felt as though I was speaking with the same boy who once played in our garden. Yet, I also saw a grown man whose looks and words awakened emotions I had long kept hidden. At one point, Zach casually brushed his fingers against my hand. It was a light, almost imperceptible touch, yet it sent my heart racing. "You know you're amazing," he said softly, his eyes focused on my hands as I nervously folded ribbons for the bouquets. "I've always felt comfortable around you." I was at a loss for words. Sitting across from him, I could feel the air between us crackling with electricity, each moment stretching out infinitely. Zach leaned in closer and kissed me again, but this time it was entirely different. It was long, deep, and filled with everything we both feared to acknowledge. I felt his arms encircle me gently, guiding us in that moment, which terrified me to shatter. I was caught in a whirlwind, unable to stop, but equally hesitant to let it continue. As we pulled away, I saw not just desire in his eyes, but also a vulnerability that often hides behind facades. "Rebecca, I can't explain what's happening to me," he said, his voice tinged with the anxiety that mirrored my own heart. "I know this is wrong," he began, but I interrupted him, placing my finger on his lips to silence him. That kiss encompassed all our doubts, our passion, and the fears we were too afraid to confront. I attempted to convince myself it was merely a moment of weakness, something that could easily be forgotten. Yet deep down, I recognized that for both of us, it meant far more than we dared to admit. When Zach left that night, I was left in silence, enveloped by the stillness of the shop. In the dark, I could still taste his kiss on my lips and felt the chilling realization that there was no turning back. Everything that had once felt right and stable suddenly appeared fragile and uncertain. I had no idea what would come next, but I understood one thing. That kiss was not just a mistake. It marked a point of no return. It was a crossing of a boundary I had promised myself never to breach. After that night in the shop, my thoughts kept drifting back to Zach. I felt as if I had lost control of my life, caught in a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't articulate or suppress. I tried to immerse myself in work, but my hands mechanically sorted through flowers, and every time I was alone, his image would materialize before me, warm and persistent, too close for comfort. I couldn't share this turmoil with Thomas. He was too engrossed in his own life, his studies and future aspirations, and I didn't want to disrupt his world with my problems. I endeavored to remain the same, a caring mother, a friend, someone always present when needed. Yet inside, everything was changing, and the further it went, the more challenging it became to hide. Every time Zach appeared at the shop's door, my heart would stop, the air between us charged with tension I couldn't ignore. One evening, while Thomas was out with friends, Zach visited the shop again. We sat on the floor, surrounded by flowers, sorting through leaves and stems, and our conversation flowed freely and effortlessly. He shared his aspirations for the future and the struggles he faced in finding his place in the world. As I listened, I suddenly realized that our conversations had transformed into something far more significant for me than mere pastime. I saw in him someone I could be completely honest with, someone with whom I didn't have to pretend to be strong and perfect. At one point, he fell silent, his gaze fixed on me with intense focus. His eyes were filled with unspoken worry, and I sensed he was grappling with something important but hesitated to voice it. "Rebecca," he began nervously, fiddling with the stems in his hands, "you do understand that this isn't just nothing, right? I can't stop thinking about you." I try, really, but he trailed off, and I met his gaze, unable to respond. His words stirred up all the fears and hopes I had been desperately trying to suppress. I knew the situation was spiraling out of control, but it was too late to stop it. We sat in the dim light, the tension between us palpable and inescapable. Without thinking, I reached out to him, simply following my heart. Our lips met once more, and this kiss was unlike any of the others. It was filled with desperation, passion, and a tenderness that was inexplicable. Zach pulled me closer, as if he feared this moment would slip away and never return. It felt like a kiss shared between two souls long lost in their feelings, unable to find their way back. I felt him tremble, his fingers softly brushing my shoulders, as if testing the boundaries of our connection. I knew this kiss wasn't merely an expression of passion. It was a desperate attempt to hold onto something significant that was slipping through our fingers. He kissed me in a way that no one had for years, without words, but with a deep understanding that left me feeling profoundly affected. "I'm sorry," he whispered when we pulled away. "I shouldn't have, but I can't help it." I found myself at a loss for words. My heart raced, and my mind swirled with thoughts of Thomas, our friendship, and the knowledge that what we were doing was unacceptable. But in that moment, I felt only one thing. I was alive, and that feeling was too intense to ignore. We both recognized it was wrong, yet neither of us wanted to back away. That kiss marked a boundary we had crossed, and each time we met, that line was pushed further. I felt like I was standing at a crossroads, on the edge of a cliff, both terrified and eager to take a step forward. Zach was the one drawing me away from my familiar world, and the pull frightened me just as much as it intrigued me. When he finally left, I remained seated on the floor, surrounded by flowers that suddenly felt lifeless and dull. I understood I couldn't turn back. Our feelings had engulfed us both too deeply. For the first time in a long while, I was at a loss for how to handle this situation. I tried to hold myself together, but each passing day became a challenge. Zach was no longer merely my son's friend. He had become the one who filled the emptiness I had ignored for so long. But with every shared glance, every word, and every gesture, I felt I was teetering on the brink of a precipice, aware that one misstep could unravel everything I had built over the years. Thomas remained oblivious, but it felt as though he sensed that something had shifted. He came home looking worn out and frustrated. The usual warmth and lightness in his demeanor had vanished. I tried to show my concern, asking about his studies and friends, but he responded with short, reluctant answers, as if something within him had snapped. He began to notice my secretive and anxious nature, yet he remained silent, while I feared to confront the truth, that I might be the reason for his coldness. One evening, Thomas arrived home much earlier than I had expected. I was curled up in the living room, attempting to immerse myself in a book when he walked in, tossed his bag into the corner, and plopped down across from me, his gaze locked onto mine. There was an unsettling intensity in his eyes, a blend of hurt and dissatisfaction I had never encountered before. "Mom," he began, unusually serious. "You've been acting strange lately. You dodge conversations, and when you do talk, it feels like you're not really here. What's going on?" I froze, unsure how to respond. My mind raced with excuses, but they all felt hollow and disingenuous.
"Everything's fine, Tomás."
"I just have a lot on my plate," I stammered, realizing my response sounded forced. He scrutinized me as if he could see right through my facade, and I felt increasingly uneasy. "Is this about Zach?" he asked suddenly, causing my heart to lurch. I couldn't believe he was addressing it so directly. "I noticed the way you two interact. You seem too close." My mind spiraled into panic, the reality of my fears crashing down upon me. Everything I had dreaded had suddenly materialized. Thomas was perceptive, and I knew there was no way to hide the truth from him. "Thomas, it's not what you think." I tried to clarify, but he interrupted me. "Then what is it?" His voice had a sharpness to it, laced with hurt and disappointment. "Mom, Zach is my friend. I trusted you both. You were always my role models. Now, I feel like I'm losing you." I was engulfed by a wave of conflicting emotions, shame, anger at myself, and the fear of losing my son. I struggled to articulate the reasons behind my actions, why I had let things escalate to this point. I understood that any explanation would only make matters worse. "Thomas, I'm just as confused," I managed to say, but his expression darkened, and he stood up, cutting me off. "I thought you were stronger," he said softly, but his words struck me like a blow. "I don't know how to see you now." He turned away, leaving me alone with my guilt and swirling thoughts. I remained seated, feeling as though an insurmountable barrier had formed between my son and me. That night, sleep eluded me. I was haunted by the realization that our lives were unraveling before my eyes, and I felt utterly powerless to mend it. What had once seemed so significant had become a source of heartache and disappointment. For the first time, I recognized that I bore sole responsibility for this chaos. Part 5. The Last Kiss and the Unraveling. In the days that followed, the house felt cold and lifeless. Even when Thomas was present, our conversations were sparse, and we avoided each other's gaze as if fearing that any word or gesture would expose the truth. I was trying to maintain a calm facade. Zach stopped visiting, and it became evident that he felt the tension too. I suddenly found myself isolated, as if the foundation of my life had crumbled, leaving me alone with my regrets. One evening, while Thomas was out with friends, I heard a knock on the door. When I opened it, I found Zach standing there, drenched from an unexpected rainstorm, his expression weary. His eyes held a mix of despair and hope, which moved me but also terrified me. I couldn't ignore his presence, yet I was unsure how to react. "I can't keep living like this," he said softly, almost afraid to shatter the fragile silence surrounding us. "I can't stay in this state, not knowing what's next." We stood at the threshold, and each passing moment felt stretched into infinity. I wanted to tell him it was over, that we needed to go our separate ways and forget one another, but the words got stuck in my throat. Zach stepped closer, and I didn't retreat, despite my inner turmoil urging me to. "Zach, everything is too complicated," I said, struggling to find the right words. "We've crossed a line." He didn't reply. Instead, he suddenly wrapped his arms around me, as if it was our final moment together, trying to hold on to something that had long slipped away. His hands were warm, and I felt a painful mix of emotions tighten within me. I knew this was a farewell moment, a time when we had to let go of everything that had connected us. Yet, the thought of doing so was unbearable. Our lips met once again, and this kiss was infused not only with passion but also with a bittersweet sense of forgiveness. It was tinged with the recognition that we couldn't be together. He kissed me with such desperate tenderness that tears threatened to spill from my eyes. This kiss contained everything: our intertwined past, our mistakes, and the fears we had kept hidden. And in that very instant, the door swung open. Thomas stood at the entrance, witnessing us in this vulnerable moment. I pulled away, but it was already too late. His gaze, filled with anguish and confusion, pierced through me. He didn't speak. He simply stared, trying to process what he had just witnessed. In his eyes, I saw everything: disappointment, anger, betrayal. "I knew something was off," Thomas said quietly, his voice shaking. "But I never thought I'd see it with my own eyes." I tried to approach him to explain that it was a mistake, that it was more complicated than he realized, but he stepped back, as if every move I made caused him pain. "Thomas, please, just listen," I pleaded, but my words felt empty and without substance. "You're my mother," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I always believed you understood how vital our bond is to me. And you, Zach, you were meant to be my friend, not shatter my family." With that, he turned and left, slamming the door behind him, leaving Zach and me enveloped in a heavy silence. We both understood this was the end. We had destroyed everything we held dear. Zach departed without a word, and I was left alone in a house filled with echoes of memories and pain. That last kiss was not merely a goodbye to Zach. It was also a farewell to a part of myself, the part that had hoped for something greater than a mundane existence. I realized I had sacrificed my son, his trust, and all my values for a fleeting moment of weakness. Now, the only thing that remained was the stark truth. There was no turning back.